Good evening, welcome everyone, and thank you for coming. As we gather tonight, we respectfully acknowledge the Wurundjeri people and their elders past and present, who are the traditional owners of this land. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to be here for our final session of the Poets in the Faith series. It seems that poetry in the context of faith has been very much alive in Melbourne this year. We owe great thanks to Mother Catherine for steering this series, both leading behind the scenes as well as chairing each monthly session. And tonight we are honoured for her to be our guest speaker. When I asked Mother Catherine yesterday to write a short bio, she wrote, "Catherine Bellhouse will be speaking about John Donne. Catherine is our assistant priest. She studied English literature at university and has a keen interest in it." Well, I think there's a little bit more to your story than that, Catherine. Having grown up in Queenscliff on the Bellarine Peninsula, Catherine moved to Melbourne in 2013 to study a Bachelor of Arts at the University of Melbourne, where she majored in English literature and philosophy. She remained at Melbourne University to undertake a Masters of Creative Writing, while also commencing a course of theological study with the University of Divinity. Her theological studies were based at Trinity College Theological School, where she also formed for the priesthood. She graduated with a Master of Divinity at the end of 2019 and priested in November 2021. She served her first curacy at Christchurch, Brunswick, and a second at St Eanswythe Church in Altona with St Clement's in Altona Meadows. Catherine joined us here at St Peter's as our assistant priest in early 2023. I've had the pleasure this year, once a month on a Tuesday morning, sharing tea and toast with Catherine, and together we have explored various poems by our featured poet of that month of our series. Catherine has that rare gift of not only being able to pause, listen, and think through lines of poetry, but also understand them historically and the context in which they have been born. She's been a wonderful poet buddy. I've learned a great deal from her, and I commend her to you tonight. Her address will go for about an hour, with time for questions and comments at the end.
Hi, welcome again everyone. It's wonderful to be with you again for our final session in this series this evening. So John Donne. After John Donne was marked out for the priesthood by no less a person than King James himself, Donne demurred, and he delayed taking holy orders for a very long time. He said he could not preach salvation to others when he was not sure that he himself was actually redeemed. And there are a lot of people who agreed with him. Donne knew himself to be ambitious, vain, impulsive. When he was 29, he eloped with a 17-year-old woman who belonged to the landowning elite of Surrey, far above Donne's station, which meant Anne lost her inheritance and her place in the world. He lost his position as secretary to the Lord Keeper of the Seals in England, and with it he lost his prospect of a successful civil career, landing them both in a life of poverty and dependence on sympathetic friends. Now 10 years later, they had 8 children in a dank little house outside London, while he was often to be found staying in London, bantering with other wits like the playwright Ben Jonson in the alehouses of Southwark. A number of his holy sonnets, which he composed at this time, convey an almost panicky preoccupation about the unredeemed character of his soul, and a desire to be awoken out of his lethargy by facing his own last hour or the world's last night.
Holy Sonnet 3. At the round earth's imagined corners, blow your trumpets, angels, and arise, arise from death, you numberless infinities of souls. And to your scattered bodies go, all whom the flood did and fire shall overthrow, all whom war, dearth, age, agues, tyrannies, despair, law, chance hath slain, and you whose eyes shall behold God and never taste death's woe. But let them sleep, Lord, and me mourn a space. For if above all these my sins abound, 'tis late to ask abundance of thy grace when we are there. Here on this holy ground, teach me how to repent, for that's as good as if thou hadst sealed my pardon with thy blood.
Often in his sonnets, Donne begins with a command. It's what creates the drama of the verse, and it's also what, in many cases, makes them prayers. In this case, the poet is commanding angels, blow your trumpets and bring on the resurrection. He adds to the drama by evoking how vast and mysterious this prospect is, the round earth and the countless unknown souls who have lived in it, which he anticipates being summoned to their bodies on the last day. In the next quatrain, that is, the next set of 4 lines, which comprise a little subsection of the poem, he expands the picture by enumerating the various ways in which a person can die, conveying a sense of the often violent shock and waste. Death at this point is not that which brings a peaceful rest at the end of a fulfilling life. Death is that which overthrows, that which slays, and it awakens a deep horror in his soul. And then comes what is often called the vault, the shift of perspective in a sonnet that occurs, in this case, in the 6 last lines, to develop the thought of the poem. And in this case, the poet uses the vault to reverse the prayer. Having started by telling the angels to cut to the chase, he now pleads with God, hang on a second, wait. And he sweeps us straight from the cosmic to the personal by saying, give me time to mourn. And here on this lowly ground, teach me how to repent. It's a great line, isn't it? I can't simply wait until I die for your mercy. I need it here and now to change me before I really face you. And then he sets that felt need for repentance in tension with another aspect of the Christian faith by saying that's as good as if thy blood had already sealed my pardon. In the Christian mind, Christ's passion is what opens the floodgates of mercy and redemption. So his as if leaves us feeling ambivalent, or perhaps that we can see something that the poetic eye cannot feel. We're left asking ourselves, has God not indeed already won his pardon with his blood? Now, Donne's anxiety about the state of his soul has to do with a lot more than his reputation for bawdiness, his elopement, or his failure to make anything of himself by 40. He once said his greatest vice was a voluptuous curiosity about almost every branch of humane learning. He read and he vexed over everything, especially questions of divinity. And with the sonnets as a whole, we see all these theological currents of early modern Europe coming to a head in the torment of an individual soul. So Donne was born about a generation into the reformations of the Western Church, about 30 or 40 years after the Church in England's break with Rome. But Donne himself was raised in a family of recusant Catholics, people who held on to their allegiance to the Pope and the Roman Catholic tradition. When Donne was sent to study Oxford at 11 years old, then to Cambridge at 14, however talented and precocious he was, he could not actually graduate like the rest of his peers, since upon graduation you had to swear an oath of allegiance to the English monarch that was designed to weed out the closet Catholics. We can imagine how confusing this would be for the talented and restless teenager. You have to succeed in this world, but you don't belong to it. And what's more, not long after Donne returned to London, his younger brother Henry was arrested for housing a Jesuit priest, and Henry died of plague in Newgate prison. Henry was only 19 years old. Donne's reaction was very interesting. It didn't inspire rage in him or fierce loyalty to anyone. It made him ask what was really so different about his family's faith that made it worth dying for. What made it so different from that of his peers and the society around him? Donne became conscious of the bluster and the uncertainty underlying much of the religious zeal of his contemporaries. The harder different people pushed to identify the one true church over and against all the other parties, the more untenable became every claim to be the one and only redeemed. How could anyone be so sure of where to stand in order to stand in the grace of God?
Satire 3. Seek true religion. Oh, where? Marius, thinking her unhoused here and fled from us, seeks her at Rome, there because he doth know that she was there 1,000 years ago. He loves her rags so, as we here obey the state cloth where the prince sate yesterday. Crans to such brave loves will not be enthralled, but loves her only who at Geneva is called religion. Plain, simple, sullen, young, contemptuous, yet unhandsome as among lecherous humours. There is one that judges no wenches wholesome, but coarse country drudges. Graius stays still at home here, and because some preachers, vile ambitious boards and laws, still new like fashions, had him think that she which dwells with us is only perfect, he embraceth her whom his godfathers will tender to him, being tender, as wards still take such wives as their guardians offer, or pay values. Careless Phrygius doth abhor all, because all cannot be good, as one, knowing some women, whores, dares marry none. Gracchus loves all as one, and thinks that so as women do in divers countries go in divers habits, yet are still one kind, so is religion, and thus blindness too much light breeds. But unmoved, thou of force must one, and forced but one allow, and the right. Ask thy father which is she, let him ask his. Though truth and falsehood be near twins, yet truth a little elder is. Be busy to seek her. Believe me this, he's not of none, nor worst, that seeks the best. To adore or scorn an image or protest may all be bad. Doubt wisely. In strange way to stand inquiring right is not to stray. To sleep or run wrong is. On a huge hill, cragged and steep, truth stands, and he that will reach her about must go, and what the hill's suddenness resists, win so. Yet strive so that before age, death's twilight, thy soul rest, for none can work in that night. To will implies delay, therefore now do. Hard deeds, the body's pains, hard knowledge too, the mind endeavours reach, and mysteries are like the sun, dazzling yet plain to all eyes. Keep the truth which thou hast found. Men do not stand in so ill case that God hath with his hand signed kings' blank charters to kill whom they hate. Nor are they vicars, but hangmen to fate. Fool and wretch, wilt thou let thy soul be tied to men's laws, by which she shall not be tried on the last day? Oh, will it then boot thee to say a Philip or a Gregory, a Harry or a Martin taught thee this? Is not this excuse for mere contraries equally strong? Cannot both sides say so? That thou mayest rightly obey power, her bounds know. Those past, her nature and name is changed. To be then humble to her is idolatry. As streams are, power is. Those blessed flowers that dwell at the rough stream's calm head thrive and do well. But having left their roots and themselves given to the stream's tyrannous rage, alas, are driven through mills and rocks and woods, and at last, almost consumed in going, in the sea are lost. So perish souls, much more choose men's unjust power from God claimed, than God himself to trust.
I don't know about you, but I find these characters that Donne is describing strikingly contemporary, as recognisable to our generation as to his. There is Mirius, who rejects what he knows at home and clings nostalgically to the church of the past. There's Krantz, who wants his religion simple and sullen with clear straight lines. There's Grias, who simply believes whatever his godparents tell him, that she which dwells with us is only perfect. I imagine probably without saying it in so many words. And then there's the mindset of Frigius. Is it Frigius? Frigius. There's the mindset of Frigius. What's mindset of Frigius? The mindset of Frigius, who does not trust any of them, because he cannot trust them all. They can't all be right. And then finally comes the pluralist, who appreciates all religions in the same way you could appreciate all the diverse and exotic habits of women. Habits being a particularly apt word to use there, since it could mean either dress or ways of conduct. But you see here that as he identifies all these types, he also sets us at a critical distance from them. Too much light has bred blindness, and there's either an underlying insecurity or an ignorance in them all. Still, Donne does not slide into cynicism. There is this strong conviction emerging in him, which is that at the level of doctrine, you will not get perfection anywhere. Truth stands on a hill and we circle here below. But what you can do is trust that God is sort of reasonable. He doesn't need you to be right. He needs you to be honest. Toward the end, the poet proposes with quite fierce conviction that when one faces God on the last day, what will matter is not that one had all the answers, but that one was earnestly searching and was faithful to that measure of truth which thou hast found. He distinguishes this from simply aiming to profess the right party line, or subscribe to the right human authority? What will it boot thee then, he asks, to say a Philip or a Gregory, a Harry or a Martin taught thee this? That sarcasm is so eloquent, and it's an attitude he returns to throughout his life. Hear this holy sonnet, written maybe 20 years later.
Holy Sonnet 18. Show me, dear Christ, thy spouse so bright and clear. What? Is it she which on the other shore goes richly painted? Or which, robbed and tore, laments and mourns in Germany and here? Sleeps she 1,000, then peeps up 1 year? Is she self-truth and errs, now new, now outwore? Doth she, and did she, and shall she evermore on 1, on 7, or on no hill appear? Dwells she with us, or like adventuring knights, first travel we to seek, and then make love? Betray, kind husband, thy spouse to our sights, and let mine amorous soul court thy mild dove. Who is most true and pleasing to thee then, when she is embraced and open to most men?
I do think I should probably apologise to Carol for making her read that rather inappropriate final jest. But the very impiety of it is the mark of the poet's exasperation. Why can't he see the church bright and clear? If she is the beloved of Christ, why does Christ leave her mired in confusion and obscurity? A question that has plagued Christians long before and long after these years of controversy. Thus the prayer on which this sonnet hinges, show me thy spouse, Christ, the one faithful to you. And yet almost immediately his skepticism emerges again about all the strident claims to have found her. Sleeps she 1,000, then pops up 1 year? There's acid in that question. He's mocking the more strident among reformers, who suppose that only with their reforms has the true church emerged again on earth. But you see how he goes from quite sarcastic to the more genuine exasperation, as if he actually does still want an answer. Does she on 1, on 7, or on no hill appear? The 7 hills could refer to the 7 hills of Rome, or to the 7 hills of Jerusalem. And the very ambiguity of the reference brings home the point. How do you know? When it comes to the 3rd quatrain of this poem, there's still no progression. The poet simply reiterates the same prayer. Betray, kind husband, thy spouse to our sights. Show me. And yet, for all that frustration, in the final 2 lines, there is a genuine development of the thought, with the poet presenting what is only superficially a paradox, that the church is most faithful to Christ when her wings, I'm changing the metaphor a little bit, when her wings are spread wide enough to shelter most people under their shadow. In a sermon towards the end of his life, Donne would say that we don't need to be perpetually seeking the church of God beyond the sea. Not over there, either richly painted in Rome or stripped bare in Geneva, but here, where you are, wherever you are, as best you may be. As he matures theologically, he comes to express this by calling the church Catholic with a lowercase c. She is universal, whole in each and every one of her parts, however imperfect they may be. And the reason he comes to believe that is that he cannot believe in a capricious God, a Christ who would forsake those who love him in Rome, or in Wittenberg, or in Geneva. leaving out the better part of his people. Increasingly for Don, it's in the person of Christ, rather than the various party lines, that the focal point of his religion emerges, and with it, firmer ground of his own redemption and salvation. Now we're going to park that topic for a moment and turn to another quite distinct dimension of his religious experience. For someone agonizingly concerned with redemption, there's one trespass for which he never really expresses any uncertainty or guilt, at least not in his verse. And that's his elopement with Anne, a marriage that, as mentioned, plunged them into poverty and lost them their purposeful roles in society. And yet, for all that it cost, Donne doesn't seem to fundamentally doubt the integrity of their union, and even its God-givenness. This, because of his experience of transcendence in and through it, in and through this rich connection with another human being. Here is the good morrow.
The good morrow. I wonder by my troth what thou and I did till we loved. Were we not weaned till then, but sucked on country pleasures childishly? Or snorted we in the seven sleepers' den? 'Twas so, but this all pleasure's fancies be. If any beauty I did see, which I desired and got, 'twas but a dream of thee. And now good morrow to our waking souls, which watch not one another out of fear. For love, all love of other size controls, and makes one little room and everywhere. Let sea discoverers to new worlds have gone, let maps to other worlds on worlds have shown. Let us possess one world, each hath one and is one. My face in thine eye, thine in mine appears, and true plain hearts do in the faces rest. Where can we find two better hemispheres, without sharp north, without declining west? Whatever dies was not mixed equally. If our two loves be one, or thou and I love so alike, that none do slacken, none can die.
What on earth were we searching for before now? The poet asks. It was like we contented ourselves with milk compared with this. The reference to weaning is a beautiful conceit right at the start of the poem, since it implies that it's not that the things that they used to desire were not worth it, were not good. We desire breast milk for a reason, the childhood pleasures too, worth desiring, and yet they are still only dreams, foreshadowing the more profoundly and ultimately desirable. But do you notice, lest the poet get too sappy with his beloved, he also makes a slightly indecorous allusion in that last line of the first stanza, to having got other beauties before her. Now it's significant that he's willing to make such a jest here, not only in bawdy lyrics for friends, but in a poem addressed to his beloved. He's willing to be equally frank with her because the point is, any other dalliance would only have been milk compared with the solid food of genuine intimacy and love. Donne very much has in him the belief of the Renaissance man, that the individual with their profound capacity for knowledge is a world unto itself. He certainly seems to find himself fascinating. I am a little world made cunningly of elements and an angelic sprite, he says in one sonnet. And this poem is about awakening to the world of another. In the second stanza, he evokes the backdrop of global exploration, voyages to new worlds, but only as a conceit. He says, let others go off and have their adventures. In you, this one other person, lies a whole world to be explored, and vice versa. Donne comes back to this idea very often, this notion that we reach the universal through the particular. We reach everywhere through this one little room. We know the world by knowing this one other soul. This is an enduring experience for Donne, and one which awakens a sense of his existence as characterized by what we might call grace, that the pleasures and experiences of the past were gifts, pointing him to the gift and wonder of romantic love. And you notice his stress on the symmetry between them. He doesn't say, for instance, "You are the world and I am the explorer," the way a troubadour might. In this ballad, both are agents, and both are worlds of their own. Compare Alexander Pope. Compare Wordsworth or Shelley. The romantic eye is the one subject and substance of the poem. This isn't the case for Donne. He's sometimes criticised for the fact that you never really get to hear the other personally in his verse. Hear the voice of Anne, for instance. But I do wonder if that criticism misunderstands the character of his work. He's not trying to make the beloved a portrait of herself, capture the other in his words. He's seeking to communicate with her, conveying metaphysical insight into a shared experience. We can see this even in the cadence of the poem and the way he varies the meter. The underlying rhythm is iambic, da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. But he varies that beat quite frequently to create a more conversational tone. The great criticism of Donne has often been that his diction is all over the place. But in a jewel like this, we find the irregularities work for the poem, not against it. For instance, you have to forget the iambs to get the sense of that last line in the second verse. Each hath one and is one. You have to lay the emphasis on the verbs. And why that's significant is because it makes the verse more intimate, a bit like breaking the fourth wall in a play. I'm not simply performing for you, I'm trying to communicate something meaningful to you. And to do that, the melodic and the conversational are equally important ingredients. In the final stanza, there's a dramatic progression. Before they were afraid to face each other, and now they do face each other. And the poet returns to the image of the world, but this time, rather than being two worlds, they are one. Each face in the other's eye is a hemisphere. Only theirs are better than those of the actual world because of the perfect symmetry. They love so alike. And that sense of symmetry ends up being the crux of the poem. If the lovers love with equal force, that love cannot die. Albeit it's a little ambiguous because is he saying that held in the bond of love, the lovers themselves cannot die? For Donne, the notion of love as mutual indwelling that holds you in life appears again and again in his work. And it's what makes language powerful to him. Your letters bring you to life in me. It's a notion that will ultimately feed into his own making sense of his relationship with God, because it's ultimately a sacramental idea. That when we commune with Christ, the Word made flesh, when we dwell in him and he in us, then even though we die, we live eternally. In these early years, Donne experiences a shadow of that divine mystery in the phenomenon of human intimacy. Now, I'm not actually going to talk about the other love poem, A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, because I'm afraid we don't have time. Forgive me. I know it's the more powerful verse. But we will still hear it, because even though it's such a different and a later context, there's a deep affinity in some of its sentiments and themes.
A valediction forbidding mourning. As virtuous men pass mildly away and whisper to their souls to go, while some of their sad friends do say, the breath goes now, and some say, no. So let us melt and make no noise, no tear floods nor sigh tempests move. 'Twere profanation of our joys to tell the laity of our love. Moving of the earth brings harms and fears. Men reckon what it did and meant, but trepidation of the spheres, though greater far, is innocent. Dull, sublunary lovers love, whose soul is sense, cannot admit absence, because it doth remove those things which elemented it. But we, by a love so much refined that ourselves know not what it is, interassured of the mind, care less eyes, lips, and hands to miss. Our two souls, therefore, which are one, though I must go, endure not yet a breach, but an expansion, like gold to airy thinness beat. If they be two, they are two so as stiff twin compasses are two. Thy soul, the fixed foot, makes no show to move, but doth if the other do. And though it in the centre sit, yet when the other far doth roam, it leans and hearkens after it, and grows erect as that comes home. Such wilt thou be to me, who must, like the other foot, obliquely run. Thy firmness makes my circle just, and makes me end where I begun.
Spectacular. And now we return to the other great and far more vexed passion of Donne's life, his relationship with God. So we're back in 1610 or 1611, when Donne also writes a religious tract called Pseudomata, which argued that even Roman Catholics could swear the oath of allegiance to the English monarch, the oath being the one stating that the Pope had no right to depose kings or intervene in the realm of civil government. This pamphlet caught the attention of a bishop in London and of the king himself. King James was very keen on it, and while he thought that Donne's past sounded too checkered to employ him in his own service, he thought that Donne would make a very useful priest instead. He would be able to defend the position of the church in England. We might well question the logic of that. Too sketchy to serve the crown, let's make him a priest. But it's also reflective of something about Donne, which is the fact that he's far more earnest and compelling when he turns to questions of divinity than when he was angling his way into court circles. There's a deeper fire when it comes to God. But even while polemically, he's defending at this point, quite confidently, some quite nuanced religious convictions. At the same time, he is writing sonnets of deep personal angst about the state of his own relationship with God. Does not the devil still have a far firmer hold on my soul than God does, he asks. Here's another of the holy sonnets.
Holy Sonnet 2. As due by many titles, I resign myself to thee, O God. First, I was made by thee, and for thee, and when I was decayed, thy blood bought that, the which before was thine. I am thy son, made with thyself to shine, thy servant, whose pains thou hast still repaid, thy sheep, thine image, and, till I betrayed myself, a temple of thy spirit divine. Why doth the devil then usurp on me? Why doth he steal, nay, ravish, that's thy right? Except thou rise, for thine own work fight. Oh, I shall soon despair, when I shall see that thou lovest mankind well, yet wilt not choose me. and Satan hates me, yet is loath to loose me.
I find those last lines so witty and so poignant. This notion of the helpless soul, that it is up to God to choose in, taps into some of the more corrosive spiritual currents of the Reformation. As I mentioned at the start, Donne was raised among Catholics, and he seems to have been well versed in the scholastic framework of theology, which teaches that God's will is essentially reasonable. Our rational soul echoes the nature of God, albeit his infinitely transcends our own. And so when it comes to the matter of personal redemption, the scholastic would more or less teach that salvation comes quite reasonably, through the manifest means given by Christ, the sacraments, and the living out of the faithful life. Whereas on the other hand, you have the great reforming theologian John Calvin, probably the most widely read theologian in England in this period. And he rejects the scholastic picture, believing the will of God is essentially inscrutable to us. This for two reasons. Firstly, our own faculties have been too profoundly distorted by sin. And secondly, God's will is sovereign and majestic, unlimited even by the dictates of logic. So when it comes to redemption, this means God's grace is irresistible and inscrutable. God wills as God wills. You can't riddle out the reason why he would or would not choose to save you. If God wants to redeem you, he will. A miracle that's out of your hands. And in the sonnet, Donne sounds rather tormented by that kind of idea. He's God's son and servant, bought with the price of Christ's own blood. So he questions at the vault in those final 6 verses. He questions, why then give me over to the devil? And he challenges God to rise up and fight for his soul, because it's up to God to choose him. He can't make it happen. He conveys this profound sense of spiritual powerlessness. And then you have those really witty and those really poignant last lines. Thou lovest mankind but won't choose me, and Satan hates me yet is loath to lose me. The faithful divine lover is absent, whereas the enemy, an abusive lover, he clings. Why? Perhaps the most famous of Donne's holy sonnets picks up on the same theme.
Holy Sonnet 14. Batter my heart, three-personed God, for you as yet but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend, that I may rise and stand, o'erthrow me, and bend your force to break, blow, burn, and make me new. I, like an usurped town to another due, labour to admit you, but oh, to no end. Reason, your viceroy in me should defend, but is captive and proves weak or untrue. Yet dearly I love you, and would be loved fain, but am betrothed unto your enemy. Divorce me, untie or break that knot again. Take me to you, imprison me, for I, except you enthrall me, never shall be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravish me.
The poet begins again with a command, and this an audacious one. Batter my heart, bend, break, blow. And in the whole sonnet there is no real vault, no progression beyond that opening demand. In the end, he is still daring God to enthrall him. And there's no indication that the absent lover has responded, nor that the poet has calmed down or gained some further insight. It's like he's saying, if you, my God, are going to be majestic and inscrutable, then I'm not going to calm down and be reasonable either. And the challenge is left there, hanging in the air. But do you notice the irony He's asking God to exert force over his soul. But he's the one delivering these forceful commands. He wants God to be the one commanding, to be prevenient and irresistible and so on. But here he is commanding God. And this because he feels he needs to be crushed and made new. Whereas there is a hint right at the start that that's not actually how he experiences God at all. You as yet but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend. The poet is not experiencing God. He's experiencing a God who is gentle, like a ray of light shining, or the human breath, a God who knocks and who seeks to enter and mend, even though the poet doesn't feel capable of opening the door. And so there's an underlying question there, for the reader, if not for the poet, in the heat of his temper. Is it that God's not choosing him? Or is it that God is seeking to knead rather than hammer his soul into shape? It's not a thought he develops in this poem, but it's there. It's part of the poetic frustration. In the second quatrain, the poet introduces the metaphor of the human person as a town with fortified walls and calls reason the viceroy. But this viceroy is failing him. Reason is corrupted, justifying what runs counter to the poet's deepest genuine desire, which is for God. He claims to love God dearly, and yet not only has he been occupied by the enemy, he's betrothed to him. And with the violence of those final verbs, unless you imprison, enthrall, ravish, the poet speaks as if he will only ever really belong to God if God treats him in the same way that the enemy does, with an irresistible and almost violent grace to break through his spiritual bonds. The next sonnet in the sequence, however, offers a striking counterpoint.
Holy Sonnet 15. Wilt thou love God as he thee? Then digest, my soul, this wholesome meditation. How God the Spirit by angels waited on in heaven doth made his temple in thy breast. The Father, having begot a Son most blessed, and still begetting, for he's ne'er begone, hath deigned to choose thee by adoption, co-heir to his glory and Sabbath's endless rest, and as a robbed man, which by search doth find his stolen stuff sold, must lose or buy it again. The Son of Glory came down and was slain, us whom he had made and Satan stole to unbind. 'Twas much that man was made like God before, but that God should be made like man, much more.
Remember and batter my heart, the poet declares himself the unrequited lover. Dearly I love thee and would be loved fain. Whereas now he says the opposite. Wilt thou love God as he thee? And we could almost hear this whole sonnet as a second voice in a conversation. Not the voice of God directly, but the poet meditating on the word already addressed to him in the mystery of Christ. The word God has already spoken, the love already shown by the Spirit in his breast, the Father deigning to choose him, significant word there, the Father deigning to choose him by adoption. And in the last 6 lines, he develops the thought by offering a parable about the redemptive side of the incarnation. A man who has been robbed, namely God, buying his stolen stuff back from the devil. And you notice he doesn't say God robs the devil or sends angelic legions to loot the stronghold. He buys us back without force, at his own cost. He becomes one of us so that it could cost him something. There's nothing original in these ideas here. Even the robbed man, it's a variation on a similar metaphor that goes back to the 2nd, maybe the 1st century. These are just the theological basics of Christian faith. But the point of the sonnet is to remember these truths so that they can sink into his own soul, like balm, like a remedy for his spiritual malaise. Once again, it's not a unique sense of chosenness that makes the difference for Don, or a unique angle on the faith that promises to redeem and make whole. It's the person of Christ, in the figure of the robbed man, who came to us whom he had made, who came to us all. In 1615, Donne accepts holy orders and stops writing so much poetry as he becomes absorbed in the composition of sermons and devotional prose. But we see in the late poems that there are, as in many of his sermons, which are what originally attracted wider interest in his poetry. But we see in the late work the sense of intimacy, once confined to human relationships, now also expressed in his relationship with God. Even when his wife Anne dies at only 33, not long after giving birth to another stillborn child. However profound his grief, he doesn't fall back into spiritual angst. It was in admiring her he learnt to seek God, he reflects, and his mind is only set the more firmly on the heaven of a gracious God. In these late works, even his grief goes hand in hand with a more serene faith. There's a beautiful poem that he wrote when travelling to Germany, only 2 years after her death. He writes as if the voyage were inevitably perilous, as if he himself were embarking on the journey of death. And in the face of such peril, he expresses a profound sense of trust and equanimity.
A hymn to Christ on the author's last going to Germany. In what torn ship soever I embark, that ship shall be my emblem of thy ark. What sea soever swallow me, that flood shall be to me an emblem of thy blood. Though thou with clouds of anger do disguise thy face, yet through that mask I know those eyes which, though they turn away sometimes, they never will despise. I sacrifice this island unto thee, and all whom I love there, and who loved me. When I have put our seas twixt them and me, put thou thy seas betwixt my sins and thee. As the tree's sap doth seek the root below in winter, in my winter now I go, where none but thee, the eternal root of true love, I may know. Nor thou, nor thy religion dost control the amorousness of an harmonious soul, but thou wouldst have that love thyself. As thou art jealous, Lord, so I am jealous now. Thou lovest not, till from loving more thou free my soul. Whoever gives takes liberty. Oh, if thou carest not whom I love, alas, thou lovest not me. Seal then this bill of my divorce to all, on whom those fainter beams of love did fall. Marry those loves which in youth scattered be on fame, wit, hopes, false mistresses, to thee. Churches are best for prayer that have least light. To see God only, I go out of sight, and to escape stormy days, I choose an everlasting night.
This is a poem about transitions, about being in a liminal space where you have to let go of one life and set of loves in order to re-clarify the subject of your desire, namely God. And at last, for once, when Dunn addresses his Redeemer, he doesn't begin with a command. The resolution has already come, and he expresses it with a sense of surrender. In what torn ship soever I embark. Why would he embark on a torn ship, we might wonder? But it's actually quite a profound reference, because it may well be a metaphor for the church. A torn ship, and yet whatsoever one it be, still an emblem of Christ's ark. And still at the narrative level, when he speaks of embarking on a torn ship, it's like he's saying, I don't care. Let it be a torn ship. Let the sea swallow me. If a storm comes, I will still see through the clouds of divine anger to those eyes that I now trust. I know the eyes now, and I know they don't despise. There was a deep uncertainty in the sonnets about being despised, a sense of shame at his feeble flesh and guilt. And it's not that he suddenly thinks he's so innocent. It's that he's more deeply conscious now of the nature of Christ himself. So, for instance, he doesn't say, I know that they never will despise me, which could imply its equality in the poetic eye. I am the reason there's no rejection. Whereas the way he phrases it, it leaves it very much about the way that Christ is. His eyes, that might turn away sometimes, but this precisely because they aren't willing to look with contempt. They will never despise. His understanding of the grace of God has very much developed, and with it his sense of the liberty of the soul. We see that sense of agency in the second stanza. I sacrifice when I have put. And then that liberty is named explicitly, if paradoxically. God doesn't control. He doesn't batter. The poet has a liberty to offer up to God, who simply seals the bill of divorce that I have to make against all the lesser loves of fame, wit, and false ambition that have dominated so much of my life. The spiritual struggle is not over in the poem. The voyage is still before the poet, to let go that he may embrace and see God only. But he's ready to make it now. Albeit ever the stormy soul, he expresses his readiness using a rather ominous and bleak concluding metaphor. In another late poem, A Hymn to God, My God in My Sickness, he conveys a more positive sense of this freeing of the soul. And it's with this poem that I would like to conclude the talk. Once again, I won't analyse it afterwards, as we've run out of time, we'll just listen. But this hymn was actually referred to in an earlier session of this series on the poet Peter Steele, who made a riff upon it in the later years of his own life. In the original, Donne, ever the lover of a good paradox, expresses a deep identification with both fallen man and with Christ, the new Adam, the human person restored to union with God, the one in whom the poet has finally embraced his own redemption.
Hymn to God, in my sickness. Since I am coming to that holy room where, with thy choir of saints forevermore, I shall be made thy music. As I come, I tune the instrument here at the door. And what I must do then, think here before. Whilst my physicians by their love are grown cosmographers, and I their map, who lie flat on this bed, that by them may be shown that this is my southwest discovery. Per fretum febris, by these straits to die. I joy that in these straits I see my west. For, though their currents yield return to none, what shall my rest hurt me, as west and east, in all flat maps, and I am one, are one, so death doth touch the resurrection. Is the Pacific Sea my home? Or are the eastern riches? Is Jerusalem, Anion, Magellan, and Gibraltar all straits, and none but straits are ways to them? Whether where Japhet dwelt, or Sham, or Shem, we think that paradise and Calvary, Christ's cross and Adam's tree stood in one place. Look, Lord, and find both Adams met in me. As the first Adam's sweat surrounds my face, may the last Adam's blood my soul embrace. So, in his purple wrapped, receive me, Lord. By these his thorns, give me his other crown. And as to others' souls I preached thy word, be this my text, my sermon to mine own. Therefore that he may raise, the Lord throws down.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for those helpful, talk about breaking open very complex, very challenging words to read. The logic and the reasoning goes in and out, and it's the density of the poetry and held by tight control, and your breaking open of that was truly wonderful. We have now a little time for brief comments and questions. So please raise your hands quite high so I can see you, because I'm quite short. Is it on now? Yes.
It's very difficult. Always when you're hearing Donne or thinking about him, you're aware of the London of that time and very aware of the extraordinary poetry being produced in the city by Shakespeare and the other dramatists, but by so many other poets at that time. And drama is one of the big things that's happening, is this kind of revolution in the way that poetry is written. And I wonder, Catherine, if you could, we've heard a number of poems this evening, and even though this, we all get worked up about the incredible analogies and stuff like that are going on, these poems, so many of them are like little plays, they're little dramas of him or them, his world, going on. So drama, maybe you could make some remarks on John Donne's dramatic personality.
I think it's interesting. One of the things about Donne is, I mentioned at the start, he used to spend time with playwrights like Ben Jonson at the same alehouses that are around the area that William Shakespeare himself was also drinking, writing, conversing in those same taverns, although there's no indication that they necessarily ever met. And I think part of what's interesting about these writers, both as poets and as dramatists, is that they're really writing at what's the beginning of the English language being really the great language of literature in that area, yeah? So you've got the King James Bible being composed to have the scriptures in the vernacular, when before they were in Latin. And that revolution of the vernacular is also occurring in Europe. And so what you see emerging both in the drama and in the poetry is this sense of the conversations that people would have at home, their voices, their jokes, hence all the humour, that actually now emerges into the letters. And with with drama, you have that incredible sense of a medium of art that can reach both intellectuals and people without access to education, and also the common man or woman. And I think you get a sense in Donne that something of that is also infusing his poetry and his approach to letters. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I just wondered how, I love Donne's poetry, I appreciated what you had to say. I do find Holy Sonnet 14 very disturbing, and I know the metaphysical poets used very extreme imagery, but I just wondered how you find the last line with the image of rape, which is what it is, actually. And that's in the middle of a divine poem that seems to say that rape is okay.
Yeah. I think I don't know. I'll respond to that. I think it is disturbing. And that's part of why I find so interesting that sense of frustration and the way he expresses it. And the way that he's asking the substance of the prayer, the way that that's counterpointed by some of the other voices that acknowledge that that's not the relationship that God is actually offering him. And that in some ways, that kind of attitude is more symptomatic of his relationship to the devil. And the way that the devil tries to exert force on his soul than it is of what is genuinely loving or genuinely divine. I think we can recognise that in the sonnets. Yeah. How we, yeah. Is there more to say there? No. Yeah. Thank you.
This is the first one of these readings I've come along to, but on that last one there, and from the earlier sonnets, I thought that Donne was talking about his relationship with the church rather than God, the person, and that it wasn't this last 14 wasn't like a personal thing, but just the emotional relationship he has with the church and state. And that it's not such a physical thing.
Yeah, so certainly it's a metaphor. It's just a question of how disturbing that metaphor is. Yeah.
Is it fair to say that back then, I mean, I don't know, I haven't done any literature, but is it fair to say they used the body more often in common parlance and as metaphor than we do today, or not really?
The body, yeah. It's a really prominent metaphor in the time, to think of society as a body, and those sorts of things. Yeah. There's just a question, I think, over on the right.
Thank you so much. We know that Donne was raised in a Catholic setting. And he also had quite a complex about his enduring illnesses throughout his life. He was very worried about dying and being unwell. I was wondering if you had any insight towards his eschatology or his impression of the afterlife, given his background from one religion and his conversion to another.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things about So certainly his preoccupation with death. Dunn's living through several of the plagues of London, and we know there's a lot of death in his own family, loss of children, and then ultimately loss of his wife, quite young. And so there is that awareness of death and that sense of decay in his work, which is really profound. I think his notion of the afterlife, what's interesting about it, is that it's not distinctively Catholic or distinctively anything. In some ways, that's sort of the point. The images that he uses are ones that are held in common, really, by most people of Christian faith. So you have the contrast of the first poem we looked at, when he talks about the angels and the numberless infinities of souls being summoned to face God, and that side of the afterlife. And then increasingly you also have this other sense of that beautiful phrase in the last poem, I'm coming to that holy room where with thy choir of saints forevermore I shall be made thy music. Now that's a pretty incredible metaphor for the afterlife. And it's more through images like that than anything else that we access his vision of that.
When he died, did he think he would be reunited with Anne, or did he see her as a saint?
He certainly refers her soul as early into heaven, taken. So there is that sense that, and in one of his holy sonnets he speaks about her being taken into heaven, and that setting his own mind on heavenly things. So there is definitely that sense of reunion of the choirs of saints, as in saints and sinners, all faithful people, at the same time that Christ is very much at the centre, increasingly at the centre of his vision.
Thank you so much, Mother Catherine, for a wonderful presentation. I'm not sure I agree with Mother Dorothy that Sonnet 14 is about rape. I'm not sure ravish does necessarily mean rape, but that's not my question. You brought out so beautifully his focus on romantic love and divine love and the tension between them in his work. And the way you presented, it sounded as though he went on a journey, arriving kind of, I suppose, at a focus on divine love.
Yeah.
Do you think that's the case? Do you think anything is lost by that transition? Yeah, that's my question.
That's a fantastic question. It's very interesting in A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, when this might be a bit of an oblique way to answer it, but I think it does. In the poem A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, when the poet is anticipating a journey away from his beloved for a period of time, he speaks at first about, well, our love goes beyond the physical. You know, it's dull sublunary lovers whose soul is sense, who lose their love when they can't see the hands and the eyes. Whereas our love has been refined before that, refined beyond that. The connection is spiritual and elusive. But then in the second half of the poem, he uses this metaphor of the twin compasses and the sense of gravity, so that when one roams, the other hearkens after it. And he even has a bit of a cheeky pun in that as well. And so what you see in that second half of the poem is there's an awareness of a bond that is physical at the same time that it's elusive. And that somehow the physical, and so gravity, physical, and yet it's not direct touch, yeah, it's elusive. And so this sense of reaching the point in love where you can't see where the physical leaves off and the spiritual begins. I think he experiences that in romantic love. He experiences that at times in his intimacy with friends and describes it. And there's a sense in which he experiences that in his relationship with God and the things of heaven as well. That there's something deeply tangible about that relationship, while ultimately it's also transcendent and elusive. Yes, so I would think he probably more describes romantic love as something that also connects you to the divine love that lies behind and beyond it, rather than the two being totally in a dichotomy. Although obviously we would see in a poem like A Hymn to Christ, he does seem to distinguish the two more sharply. Yeah.
Well, I think we have one more question.
It's a very short one, and we have to finish with it, I think. Is A Valediction Forbidding Mourning the best poem ever written?
My spiritual director said that it is, so I do too. Thank you.
Thank you again, Catherine. And here are these flowers are for you, and that's for you too. Next year, as many of you already know, Mother Catherine will be leaving us, sadly, from St. Peter's and travelling up north to take up the position as director of the Christchurch St. Lawrence Centre at Christchurch St. Lawrence in Sydney. And I'm sure we will stay connected, all of us, and look forward to hearing about your work there. Tonight is our final session this year of Poets in the Faith. And here at St. Peter's, we've been very much enjoyed hosting this series. And thank you all for participating. And finally, may I remind you that a survey is available for you to fill in. You can hand it in the baskets as you leave, or if you need to think about it or would like to think more about it, you have up until the end of November and you can hand it into the book room, and I'll make sure it gets passed on. We hope to host another series of arts and faith talks in the latter part of next year, and we'll send an email to all who have registered for the Poets Talks to inform us that about this series when it comes. Once more, thank you everyone.